Well, hello and welcome to another installment and a new series on the Disciple Makers podcast, To Live as Christ. Today, I'd like to introduce to you the other part of this marriage. This is Catherine. This is my wife.
Hello.
She's whispering. Don't let that fool you. She's full of good energy and vigor. She's just fueling up with coffee. So this series will focus on just having a conversation between you and I, like we would at home, in front of our friends who may be watching this. And we're going to talk about, just ministry, sharing life together. And disclaimer, we're not perfect. She's not, and I am not. And before I even put her on that, I'm not perfect. She will tell you all about it as we go through this series. We're going to do basically 6 episodes. And what we'll do is talk about different aspects of being a married couple where the husband's called to be the pastor, the only biblical model there is. And what does that look like for our home? Does that look like for our marriage? And just thinking through some questions about the before ministry, how we entered ministry, and what are our hopes and prayers as we look to, our golden years, Lord willing, if the Lord gives us life, to be there. And what do we look forward to having said, we've accomplished this? Or better yet, to put in more biblical terms, God has done this through us. So do you have any opening thoughts as we begin this conversation?
Not really, other than now we just have witnesses to everything, so we may regret this later.
Regret is a very strong word, and I don't think we will. So I guess today we're going to talk about the call before and after we said yes. And so let's start with the first question. What we wished someone told us before ministry. What are some of those things that, looking back, and by the way, I have been working for church as an associate pastor and a senior pastor in those two primary roles since 2015. So right now that marks what, 11 years? Yeah, because it's 2026 right now.
Mm-hmm.
So roughly 11 years. And so after a decade, I thought it'd be fun for people to get to know the better half of this marriage, but also just to have a conversation as to looking back, living in San Antonio, looking for a job, praying for 6 months that the Lord would open a door to work for a church. So that's going to be the first question. And I would love for you to give us your thoughts. What we wish someone would have told us before we enter ministry. So under that, here's the thing. What assumptions did we have about ministry life? Did you have any assumptions?
Well, I think it was kind of interesting because I had not intended to marry a pastor, so I didn't really have that many assumptions.
Right.
I think some of my assumptions didn't underestimated some of the challenges we would face ministry-wise. Was probably the biggest one, especially really early on. And I think I sort of assumed that it would be easy, that people would automatically respect you as a pastor or respect us in ministry and leadership. And some of those things didn't happen. We came across a lot of challenges that kind of floored us initially that we weren't really prepared for. And I think it was one of those, oh, well, that happens to other people, but it doesn't happen to me sort of scenarios. And I think that's kind of where I was in the beginning. Well, we're not going to have those issues. And we did. And so I think that was probably maybe some of my initial assumptions that weren't correct.
Right. So for me, answering this question, so I was born in Mexico, raised in Southeast Texas, near Houston in Liberty County. And so for me, it was a lot of uncertainty in that I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, finished high school. And so took 1 year away from college at the age of 17 when I graduated so that I could discern what my life was going to be because options were kind of limited. But one of the things that I see looking back was the ability to meet and to be mentored by some wonderful people like Jimmy Van Dorn, who was the pastor of Central Baptist Church in Diceta, Texas, and being loved by him and his family and encouraged to serve in the church, even though with I would call them handicaps, a lisp, an accent. And these are things that when I went to college, especially to a speech class, the professor said, you already have attention getters, use them, don't be ashamed of them. I said, okay. So working through that was good. The other thing that helped was being mentored by a director of missions. And for people who are not connected to the Southern Baptist life for all the good, bad, and the ugly, that is basically a pastor to pastors. And so being able to work alongside him, doing Spanish ministry, doing also church planting, doing special events, and working with other pastors, seeing what that looked like on a regular basis was a definite blessing for me to begin to learn what ministry was like. So for me, the assumption was, because I had been trained by two wonderful men who were very devoted to the Lord and their ministry. One, you're going to have to give it your all, because I remember a lot of the events were early morning or late evening as we were dealing with people's work schedules, even as we do now. And the other one, which I had hoped had not been true, but dealing with the heartache of people who are about their own agendas coming against someone in leadership, say the pastor. And that happened to this man, and it happened multiple times. But one of the things that I loved learning from them as we would sit down for either breakfast, lunch, dinner, as we were driving to do visits, is the assumption that regardless of what you go through, God, if you are following God's command, He'll get you through it. And I think for us, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, we've seen that happen. And that's one of the positive assumptions. One of the negative assumptions, which you mentioned as well, was, well, you're a pastor, people are going to somehow respect you because of the positional leadership, which that was I would call it a childish assumption, but one that we see because we are trained, especially if you are raised up in a church, to respect the person who is preaching and teaching, the person who is supposed to be trustworthy enough to handle the word of God. And sadly, we see that in a good way is not true, and also in some bad ways, especially in the last 5 years, where pastors have faltered because of their public persona being brought forth, where that's also sadly not the case. And so we are dealing with those presuppositions about life in ministry. And also, I thought, if I'm going to be in ministry, my life's going to be fantastic. No conflict at home, no conflict with the kids, and God's going to take care of everything. I don't have to worry about it. And there's a certain degree of truth to that, but then there's also the rose-colored petals type of sunglasses that fell off fairly quickly early on in ministry.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I see that. And I think that was, I think I had that assumption about how pastors would be treated because I I was just taught in general to respect elders growing up. And of course you respect who's in leadership in your church. That was just a given. But I had never grown up or been close to anyone in leadership ministry really to I was very much an observer. And so I saw it with very much outside eyes and had no understanding of the inner workings that went behind all of that. So, you know, I really was just sort of ignorant of how in ministry life was at the time when we kind of entered into this initially. But knowing what I know now, would I have changed my decision? No, of course not. But it definitely was a bit of a reality check when we started dealing with some of these issues. And we're like, oh, that's not kind of what I thought it was going to be like. Similar to your expectations in marriage, you expect certain things out of your spouse. And then when you get married, those things aren't what you thought, or they're slightly different. And so you have to readjust your expectations.
right. So communication, communication, communication.
What surprised me most in the first year, honestly, what probably, I guess, shouldn't have surprised me, what did was the incredible opposition to our age, and lack of children. And while I admit that we were generally young starting out in ministry, especially for a pastoral calling,
As an associate pastor, no less.
right. I understood. I assumed that, and maybe this also plays into the assumption part, that all of the education that you had would sort of counter the age factor. And you had been working on ministry roles for a long time. And though they weren't quote unquote official pastor positions, you had been volunteering, you had been specifically trained, you weren't ignorant of how ministry ran on some levels. And so the constant, well, you're too young to do this, and you couldn't possibly understand or know what you're talking about theologically or sermon-wise because you're too young or you don't have kids, kind of took me off guard a little bit. And while I understand there are some things we simply couldn't understand because we hadn't experienced them yet, that didn't change the biblical foundations. And so, sort of being discounted as being able to be of use biblically just because we were young was one of the more shocking things. Probably another was the how on call you really were. Like, in my mind, I knew that it's kind of a 24/7 job, but when you were actually basically on call 24/7 and people didn't respect your boundaries, that was another thing that was really shocking was, oh, it's 9 o'clock at night. Let's just call the pastor. And it's not even emergent. It could wait till tomorrow, but why not? That was another thing. It was kind of like, well, wait, I want to like go to bed or spend time together, but somebody needs something. So that was a little bit shocking too, that people felt so free to just do that.
Well, for my part, I think it's kind of funny how you mentioned that. For my part, one of the things that I was surprised by is how easy and how tempting it is to not have the boundaries. Moving after 4 years back to San Antonio and going into a chaplaincy role, which was totally different than being a pastor, and then going into training in San Antonio to be a chaplain as a vocation, just because we didn't know at that time whether the church was going to be the place where God would have us as a lifetime of ministry or whether it was going to be through chaplaincy, is how easy it is to not say no.
Right.
It's very easy to want to please others, especially starting in the first year. You don't want to give people the bad impression. However, going back to 2015 and how things kind of played out everywhere throughout that beginning phase of ministry, I think that's what really surprised me the most. It seems like this is an us thing. It's very easy to want to please people. And I wonder if that's not why the Bible says that an elder needs to be sober minded, that he needs to be well equipped to handle the word of God, which we do not discount, but also that he needs to be able to manage his household well. I think everything has to do with the boundaries of spiritual awareness for self, spiritual awareness for the family,
Hmm.
and also the spiritual awareness of the church family. So I think that was for me the most surprising thing that came out of that particular first year. It was fun. It was great being mentored by someone who had been in ministry for well over 30 years, someone who had not only military experience, but also ministry experience, and who was working and had worked, through convention, state level leadership with different organizations to being a pastor for a rural church
Right.
with less than 200 members. So I think that was the most surprising thing is it's very easy to say, okay, sure, I'll be there, or not want to let people down. Anything else you want to share about this particular question?
No, not necessarily. I
Okay.
think I think we've kind of covered that part.
Okay. Well, here's another one. What did we underestimate emotionally or spiritually about the first entering ministry? What are some of those things that we underestimated?
I would say we probably underestimated how strong some of the spiritual attacks could be. And then the emotional toll they ended up taking on us with some of the
Mhm.
things we encountered later on. I think we really truly weren't ready. We weren't, maybe we were gullible or whatever, but we weren't anticipating some of the events that happened. We weren't looking for the worst in certain people who ended up, unfortunately, surprising us in a very negative way.
Right.
And so we weren't quite ready for that. And I think we didn't understand boundaries very well then. And so we hadn't really been guarding ourselves in our own marriage to some of that effect. So I think that made us a little more vulnerable emotionally in how we connected and dealt with some of those issues when they first happened. And so the other thing is, I think I can't speak as much for me as far as your job and the toll it took on you, but I do know that I think we didn't understand how to communicate our emotions well. And I kind of had this I don't know, idea in my head that this was ministry and we had to just sort of grin and bear it. And I couldn't complain or I couldn't say, hey, this is really bothering me, or I feel like we're not connecting, or whatever these things are, because, well, that's just ministry. We're there to serve and do these things. And so that's just the price you pay for it. And that I think that led to the temptation for bitterness or resentment to sort of creep in, and this sort of almost not true wall, but sort of this kind of barrier to us communicating well, because we kind of let these other things get in the way and become more important, or just not deal with them because we didn't want to create a tension or seem like we didn't have it together or we weren't on the same page. And so I think we kind of weren't dealing with those preemptively, and that let it build up later on. But I also think we just truly weren't, life was great and till it wasn't. And it
Right.
happened very quickly, and we weren't quite ready for that. And I mean, sometimes you can't anticipate those things. Um, but I don't think we'd also been recognizing some of the issues for what they were. And so I think that it caught us even more off guard, honestly.
I can see that. I think for me, the biggest thing was emotionally. One of the things looking back that I hope I'm practicing better now is learning to stand on my own 2 feet while still being open handed enough with people so that they can be part of my life, but
Mhm.
not hold them on a pedestal. And I think that for me was the thing. Now, part of my story is my dad died when I was 11. So I always look for role models who are older and now almost at the threshold, I'm sorry, of 40 years old. It's getting to a point that looking to the elder men around me is getting to be more looking to my peers and understanding that now I get to be the role model for others, hopefully, and a positive one, a godly one. And so for me was underestimating the emotional attachment to people that I looked up to when we first started and almost like needing the validation from them. So I think I underestimated the need for, like I said, being able to be my own man and finding my own voice. I think that that would have helped more and definitely been better to do that and do it with grace, which is another thing that spiritually I think was quite underestimated by me. I think it could have been an us thing, but I'll just speak for me. Is the idea of just because somebody goes to church, just because somebody serves or leads in a ministry or a group, it does not mean that they are where you are spiritually. And of course, hindsight is 2020. That's the saying. And I think that's one of those things that I underestimated spiritually is that just because someone's leading the youth or the children or leading even as an elder or deacon or whatever in a position of high trust, it does not mean that we are in the same place spiritually, and that needs a nuance of discernment on my part, discernment on their part, but it also means that we need to be cognizant, being aware that because we're not in the same space spiritually, you need more patience. You need to work extra hard with those relational cues and being able to talk to people and relate with them. Because again, yes, 15 years ago or 14 years ago, when we started this journey together, when we started dating, and then as our family was founded in 2014, we had only been married for what, not even a year. And we go into our first ministry assignment, which was by the grace of God. I do not wish that any of this had been any different because God has a purpose for it, but it certainly taught us.
Mm.
So looking back on being my own man, underestimating the emotional intelligence to be strong enough to stand on my own 2 feet without seeking outside affirmation, trusting who God made me to be as a pastor, as a husband, etc. But also, again, to kind of cap this off, is being able to discern that there's even in positions of leadership, not everyone is in the same place, spiritually speaking. And that has huge implications because, again, I was always taught to try and trust and see the best in people. It's part of my positive attitude to want to see the best in people and try to give the best of myself. And at the time, I thought, well, I have to be 100% all the time. It took me going through the recovery from this first position and then going through chaplaincy training to understand sometimes in ministry, 100% that you can give is going to be 60% of your total energy
Right.
because there's different circumstances, there's different situations, and there's different demands. And sometimes our health and our emotional health is included in that, also plays into it. So I think that's something that's what I underestimated. And it seems like we were almost in a similar space, you and I.
I think so. I think another thing that being the outside observer to what you did, because it affected me in a different way, was I think we both underestimated the emotional toll it would take on you because you have such a shepherd's heart and you care and you want to invest in your church, which are not bad things at all. But initially, there was that struggle to create certain boundaries and also sort of um, almost compartmentalize a little bit. Hey, when I'm home, my attention needs to be here. You carried a lot with you that I think you didn't realize as much how it affected you at home. And then on top of that, our situation, I was working full time and I was gone for 3 days at a time usually
Working at night.
and working at night. So my schedule was different. We were often on different schedules. So that didn't give either of us the emotional support sometimes with each other
Right.
because we were often in kind of different places. And I was sort of half removed from the church and the community by the nature of my job. I just couldn't be there quite as often. And that created some of its own unique circumstances with us relating emotionally. And so I think that created this sort of weird distance in how do we deal with these things without seeming uncaring or unfeeling or not wanting to understand. And I think we just didn't know how to quite navigate that early on.
Right. I can see that. Well, here's the other question. How did ministry change? Are you ready for this one? Our marriage dynamic. And I think you already hinted on that.
Well, what's funny? It did and it didn't. Especially if we're talking really early on, we had the advantage of knowing what we were sort of getting into from the very beginning.
Right.
Some people don't. They're called later on after they're married. And so that I think is sometimes a little bit of a harder change to deal with. I knew before we got engaged early on when we were in a relationship that if we were going to go through with this is where we were headed, was a life of ministry. And so I had a bit of a heads up on kind of what that looked like, even though I had no idea where God was going to take us. I at least had the advantage of, okay, life is not going to look like what I thought. I certainly didn't plan. It wasn't on my list when I was 10 and I wrote out what I want in a guy. I'm going to marry a pastor. That wasn't on my to-do list. Okay. But I did get that advantage. Now, I think ministry prior to kids was different than after, obviously.
Yeah, children have a way of throwing a monkey wrench
Right.
or three in
And,
our case.
prior to kids, it was so much easier for us to adapt to the situations, to be involved. We were our own agents per se. And so we could adjust our schedules. We could just pick up and go, and it wasn't a big deal. After kids, obviously that changes things, but then it also very much changed how we functioned in ministry, especially early on, because we're still trying to establish boundaries. We had other things going on. I had an incredibly weird work schedule with where we lived. And so it made things more difficult in that aspect. I think the other thing is it forced us into this place marriage-wise where we had to learn how to support each other. And I don't think we always knew that as well early on, especially because the particular church we were in didn't understand how to support us as married. And so we had that obstacle already. There was a lack of understanding of boundary and family comes first. And that offended a lot of people, unfortunately. And how do we navigate trying to grow this relationship and still serve? And I think that was something we were really like in the throes of trying to figure out.
So a lot of first happened right as we were going into our first assignment.
Mm-hmm.
So we're married, not even a year. We get there, and not long after that, we have Michael,
Yes.
who's our oldest. And then about 18 months later, right, we have 15. There you go. Yeah, 15 months later, we have our second son, Ethan. And of course, dealing with him was even extra. It was not burdensome, but it was challenging because at one point the imaging for him showed that he might not have his brain develop inside of his head and that there may have been issues there. Thankfully, it was not the brain being formed outside of the skull as the imagery person when we were going to get your ultrasound thought. It ended up just being a cyst. And even then, that was traumatic for him. And it definitely changed the way we had to do life for about almost a whole year early on. And he had two surgeries because they needed to make sure to remove everything. So I think it wasn't necessarily that ministry changed our family dynamic, but the first entrance into ministry changed everything. Almost 2 hours away from the biggest city center, that would be San Antonio, and then dealing with my mom also living with us. So there was very little room for us to know who we were as a family. Not the typical family setup like you see in typical books where the husband goes to work, the wife, she may work, but she's generally home because when you were home, you were asleep for 3 days out of the week, and then you had to do a flip, and that was also a challenge. I think for us, the biggest drastic change in our marriage was uh, just the unknown factors that we couldn't control. Because, like you said, and just to kind of give everyone more feedback or background into this, when I meet Catherine, I tell her, "Hey, I know that the Lord called me to be a pastor. I don't know what that's going to look like. For all I know, I'm going to be living under a bridge because you never know. And so, if you want to continue this relationship, just know that that's what this life is going to be like. And if you don't, that's okay. We can be friends." And I remember that was the longest week of my life because then you went to think and you came back and said,
Right.
okay. And I still remember that your mom and your sister were very mad at me because I took my sweet time to propose to you simply because I wanted to have a job before I was able to propose to you, kind of important. Old fashioned values, that's all I can say. So, but that seems like that's where we are in that area of what we wished someone had told us before ministry. Now, here comes the next one. When one feels called more than the other. I don't think we had this, but it's good just to talk about this. First question: did we feel equally called to at the beginning?
I mean, you sort of already answered that halfway. I think, no, we didn't, but not necessarily because we were already married and you got a call and I'm like flailing over here. What the heck, you know?
Right. This was not a
It was
second career for me.
right. This was what you were already called to. This was not what I had initially anticipated for a husband.
In many ways.
But I think, after I'd spent some of that time in prayer and thinking and all those sorts of things, I did have that reaffirmation from God that no, this is the guy and this is who I want you with. And this is the life you're going to be called to. And so I think at once that was solidified, then we were on the same page as far as that goes. This is the ministry. This is what we're called to, and we're in this together. So, yes and no, like we pretty much were from the beginning, but there was that initial period of, is
I
this
don't know if
really where I'm
this, yeah.
supposed to go?
I don't know. This guy's pretty something. I remember my friend Daniel at the time said, "You're on a mission from God." Amen. She is on a mission from God. I would say, because people ask, especially through when we are being considered to go to a church, like when we came here to New Mexico to Vista Grande Church, they ask, well, how did you guys meet? How did you end up? And I remember one of the things I like telling people about is how from the get go, I knew that my calling was in ministry. I just didn't know what type of ministry. I tell people, and this is part of how I encourage people to find a place of service in the church. My first place of ministry in the church back in Isetta, Texas, was to clean the restrooms and clean the fellowship hall. And that was I was serving the church. That's what my mom did for a long time, so I helped her. The other thing was after that, then started working with the youth, with wonderful youth directors that we had at the time, and David and Kathy McCluskey and others
Mhm.
like Rita Sanders and Mr. Raymond, who were part of the youth department at the time,
Right.
and just being there helping however I could. And then my pastor, I remember asking me to do the Wednesday evening service. And then from there, it went into, hey, they found out that I have somewhat of an okay voice to sing. And then I started doing the choir, special music. Then I started leading the congregational singing at church. And then I remember back, I think, well, that picture that hangs on the wall right now,
Right.
back in 2014, it was one of the very first sermons I ever gave at my home church. And I remember Mrs. Spinks, God bless her soul, she came up to me and said, "You don't know nothing." And then she just walked out the door. And when some families in the church knew that I was called to ministry, she and her husband were some of the first people to support me financially to go to school. So for me, this has always been the call, and God kind of made it more evident. No, you're going to be a pastor and preacher. And so that's always been encouraging to me. And what was a blessing to me is that when I shared that with you, you didn't shy away from it. Yeah, you did the right thing. you prayed, you sought God's guidance, but you didn't shy away from it. And one of the things, even now looking back and fast forward to today, I love the fact that even you are teaching in the women's ministry, that you're helping disciple women for Christ and even discipling our boys. Something that we have grown into is that with the devotions at home, sometimes it's like pulling teeth. Sometimes it goes by too quickly, but I love seeing the light bulbs go off when the boys hear the scriptures. They remember the stories, and I love it when Ethan goes into little preacher mode and tells the whole story in like 2 minutes. So I think we were equally called. I think it was just God confirming that we were going to be called together. And to me, that was amazing.
Absolutely.
So here's the other one. What happens when one spouse is passionate and the other one is hesitant? Have you ever been hesitant? And if so, in which ways?
I mean, I think it's very situational and it depends. There have been times where neither of us were maybe quite sure what the next move was, or one of us felt pretty sure. I can speak for myself. I think it's more often you probably felt pretty sure and I was a little bit hesitant. And that's not always a bad thing. Hesitancy is not always bad. And I think that initially I think that would sometimes frustrate us because we weren't like, oh, it just doesn't click right away. But sometimes that hesitancy needs to happen either because of timing. It's not the right time to make the move. And he's a go-getter. And so he doesn't always like to wait. He wants to just go and do because he's excited and he's ready. And that's not a bad thing. But sometimes the timing's not right yet. And so I think sometimes my hesitancy, especially now, is not so much, I think it's bad. I think it's more wait. In the beginning, I would probably tend to be more hesitant because I definitely struggled with anxiety a lot when we were first married. And what does this look like? You know, I like to be in charge. I like to be in control. And in ministry, that usually doesn't happen. So learning that took me a while to figure out, but it also forced me to learn to trust in ways that I didn't ever have to before. And it couldn't be me. I had to learn to trust God and I had to learn to trust him, and that I may not have the answer, but he can make the decision and it's okay. I don't have to be the one doing all the decision making. I'm not perfect at that, by the way. I'm still working on it. But I don't think that's bad. And I think there have been times where I have felt like, you know what, this is probably the way it's going to go. And you weren't sure. And you said, well, you know, I don't know. We need to pray. You might have, you know, I think especially really early on after we moved from our first church, there was a lot of self-doubt and double questioning on some
I think
things.
if we are honest, there was a lot of hurt.
That too.
And that is what caused when we first entered this, it was just you and me. The Lord blessed us with two wonderful boys who are all boy, both of them in their own way. And then my mom moves in with us, and until we moved to New Mexico, she lived with us. And that, I think that's what clicked for me, in the sense of not only do I have to care spiritually for those that are under my care, but I need to make sure my family's okay. And I think for me, that was the biggest source of wanting not to put you guys through that, because we were healing from that for
Right.
like a good 2 years.
Yes.
I remember that because it was a constant miscommunication. Sometimes there was arguments and sometimes there were fights that happened. And I'm not proud to say that, but I'm happy to say that now because we worked through it. And through the help of some wonderful friends, the first ones that come to mind are Jorge and Dalia. And with their help and their guidance and just their friendship, it really transformed everything. And that kind of opened the door to not want to be hesitant or to be led by fear and pain.
Right. And I think that's more the difference is, were we hesitating because we wanted to take time to pray for wisdom and discernment, or were we hesitating because we were just scared of being hurt again or
Right.
scared of rushing into a situation? And so I think it sort of ebbed and flowed with us in different ways. And oftentimes it was not both of us at the same time. But I think that was a good thing because it wasn't both of us being so cared or both of us being so gung-ho that we were making poor choices. It was one balancing the other. Hey, I know this is it. Don't be afraid. And the other one saying, okay, I need to learn to trust and let's work through this together.
Right.
And so I think it was kind of this give and take where we were supporting each other through those different parts of healing and growing. Is the pastor's spouse automatically in ministry?
Okay, so there's an expectation from churches. Most of the time it's quiet. Sometimes it's not so quiet, where they do expect you, at one point they did expect you to be at everything and to always be present. And if you weren't there, there was always the question, how is she doing? Is everything okay? And taking it with a grain of salt. Okay, they're concerned for you. I like that. But then there's always this tacit pressure, it seemed at first, that if you weren't there, you were not equally devoted. Now, I don't know if that was different because we were younger, because I didn't see that happening with the other pastor at the time that we were working with. But granted, there was also a bigger age difference, and
And
they
they were
were
rare, yeah.
retired, and they were able to do things, a lot of things together. So there was a lot of grace into that. However, looking back, 2020, hindsight, I would say no. The pastor's wife, and I'm being very careful to say that, the pastor's wife is not in ministry. You don't get a twofer, meaning you're not going to pay one salary just to get two people, and to just kind of, not to make fun of you, but just to make a point for you watching. She does not play the piano. She does not play guitar. She does not, I mean, she doesn't even play the ukulele or spoons or strings on a wash drum, none of that.
If you're lucky, you might get the recorder out of me, but I only know like one song.
Yeah, so don't do that. But our churches have been told, especially as we learn to be more confident and just to be more in our own skin, more comfortable in our own skin. You may call me as a pastor, but my wife, if the Lord leads her to plug in or not, she's not required. And
Right.
if that's a hard no for you, then that's a conversation. But I think at first it was almost like, well, we don't know, we'll see. I don't think it was an open expectation. I think some people may have that quiet expectation, but I don't think we've seen that. But we've gotten more comfortable telling people, you're not hiring her. Her ministry is our kids, because we homeschool. Your ministry is to be my support, because you're my wife and my partner. And if the Lord leads you to, for example, here at Vista Grande, you're helping Carla, who is the leader of our women's ministry, and you help where you can as a volunteer, but you're not revered. No one calls you first lady, because you're not in politics, and no one calls you anything goofy. You're just Catherine. You're a sister in Christ foremost, and for me, you're the apple of my eye, because you're my wife. So I think at first there may have been that, well, I don't know, I don't want him to feel like she's not equally called, and even now I don't think that we have that problem. What do
Yeah.
you think?
So I think it's a sort of a yes and a no question. And this is why I say that. Am I called to do jobs? No, unless I'm specifically called, but it's not an automatic because you were a pastor.
Right.
Am I in ministry alongside you? Yes.
Man.
And if I'm not, then there's a bigger problem, because that's a discord within our marriage that is certainly not going to help you in your ministry and what God has called you to do. So on some levels, yes, by being married to you, and in particular because I had the advantage of knowing ahead of time, I knew that I was taking sort of that on to support him in ministry. Now, I think the expectation part was sort of a twofold issue. In some of our earlier areas, there definitely was an undertone from people, in particular the women, that I was supposed to be involved and I was supposed to do these things or be present or whatever. And in our first church that we were called to, I burnt myself out, I think, because I was working constantly, taking care of babies, stressed out by this, and trying to be at all these things all the time. Sometimes I felt like we were never home. Like that's how much we
Right.
were always going places. And so I definitely didn't know how to sometimes put boundaries either, because I didn't want you to look bad and I wanted to be there to support you. And I thought, well, that's how you do it, right? And I totally didn't get it. I didn't have people to tell me that either. I didn't really have good mentors who could say, this is kind of how you run in ministry. I didn't have great examples. I hadn't grown up knowing people in ministry, so I didn't have a really good foundation for what that looked like as a pastor's wife. And I grew up in an era where it was definitely expected that the pastor's wife was basically a twofer. A lot of the really quote unquote fundamental in a bad way churches definitely expected that out of the pastor's wife. They were very, I don't know how to say it, but traditional in a negative sense. There wasn't tradition for the sake of worshiping God. It was, we've always done it this way and this is the expectation, the old guard, that kind of thing. And so that's what I saw. And so I assumed, well, that's what you do, right? You're supposed to be there for your husband and figure it out. And that whole Proverbs 31 woman thing, I took definitely out of context and to an extreme because I didn't know how to do it. Um,
And I think that's something that we've learned to look for over the last
right.
several years is what are some good, healthy examples, whether they're pastor, elder, you name it, that we can just learn from them? Because, yes, that was available, but there was always a sense of, and this may be our personalities, correct me if I'm wrong, where even in dealing with the automatic call to ministry to be in a department or oversee something, it's the idea of, well, we're failing and we have to reach for help. It almost feels that way.
I think it definitely used to more than it does now.
Right,
And I think we've learned that because there were points later on, which eventually we'll kind of get into those, where we did have to stop and say, we need to autocorrect some things. We need to
right,
put some things on pause and figure it out. And so as time has gone on, I think we've learned, especially as we have learned to communicate better through some of that, where our boundaries are. And like, these are hard lines. Like, we're not going to cross these boundaries. There are certain things I don't do. And that's not to say I don't support and I'm not involved, but my priorities are over here first with
well,
our children and with supporting you in
right,
marriage. And anything beyond that is what God calls me to do specifically in the church, but it's not an expectation. Here in Vista Grande, it's pretty much a non-issue. If there is anyone who expects that out of me, they definitely don't make it obvious, and it's certainly not the majority. The last church we were at, I think it was probably 50-50. There were some who did have that bit of that expectation of me and some who didn't. But churches prior to that, there was definitely an undertone. And so figuring that out was hard.
right,
But I did come to understand that my job was to support you.
right.
What that ended up looking like might change based on our situations, but it wasn't I'm just basically working for free.
Yeah, no, that's a no-go. And with that in mind, I think the thing we can encourage anyone who's watching this conversation and joining it is how to discern a calling together. Communication, communication, communication. And by that, the man, and I'm gonna be very clear out of the gate, only men are called to be pastors. So that's the biblical model. It's what we see in the Greek. It's not a neuter term. It's men are called to be pastors. You teach here at the church. That's not a violation of scripture. Why? Because you're teaching women or you're teaching children. And when, for example, when we have right now our Sunday school class, there's facilitation between all the leaders that are gathering there for Sunday school. So it's
Mhm.
not just you teaching a mixed group of people. I think what would help is don't be afraid as a man whose call is following the call to be a pastor, an elder, a preacher, an evangelist. Don't be afraid to just have frank conversations with your spouse if you're already married. If you're single, going to seminary, going to school, pray that the Lord would make evident who that person is that will be your fitful helper, as the Bible calls the wife, and talk to your, fiance, girlfriend, your intended, and talk about what is it that they see God doing and talk openly about those things. And I also need to make sure you understand we are very unique in the way we think because Catherine was already working when I met her. She was helping her mom with house and other things. I was living in San Antonio. My family was back in the Houston area. Most of them. We had good mentors. The Birds
Mhm.
were always there, and both Craig and Melissa always wanting to step in when we needed them. I mean, they did our premarital counseling, which was amazing. And it's one of the most wonderful things. And they even encouraged us. You always have to talk to each other. You always have to have the hard conversations. Was it easy at first? No.
Yeah.
Has it gotten easier? Yes.
Yes.
And so I think that's one thing that we can do. And what would you tell to a lady who's considering following her husband into ministry?
I would say you need to seriously consider your role. Whether you are, looking to marry someone who is called into ministry or it's a career change, there has to be some sort of unification. You're not going to agree on everything. There's going to be questions. There's going to be times where, like when we were, praying about where God was taking us next, which ended up being here, we didn't agree on all the churches, and there was like, okay, well, there's not an agreement, and so why? Where are the red flags, or where are the things that don't sit quite right? you're going to have that. You're not going to be 100% on the same page all the time. That would be unrealistic. Have realistic expectations. But know what you're getting into and be ready to be in it, and support him. There can't be a 50-50 and you back out later sort of deal. That's not how this works. You're either in it or you're not. And if you're not sure, then you don't make that commitment. If you're already married and it's a career change and y'all aren't on the same page,
Pray,
pray a lot.
pray.
And do you have reservations? Okay, you need to work through that. Have some honest discussions. Is it genuine? Maybe you're not really called, or is it just anxiety about what that might be? There's
Change is difficult.
right. There's a lot that goes into that. But, spend a lot of time in prayer and be honest where your concerns and your struggles might be, because you really need to have proper expectations. And I think that was something that we didn't do probably as well as we should have, is what are our expectations in ministry? We talked a lot about marriage, but we didn't talk as much about, as a ministry couple, what are our expectations of each other? What do we expect as far as how our marriage functions in ministry? And so those are things you might want to iron out, because that's going to help you set your boundaries early on, avoid hopefully some resentment or other issues with each other, because you've kind of already said, hey, these are the ground rules. These are the things that we're going to work within, ahead of the time.
Well, let's make this our last question for this episode. What advice would we give to engaged couples entering ministry? What would you encourage the wives to do?
Well, definitely a lot of prayer, because it is going to be hard. As much as God may be calling you to it, it is not easy. And there are going to be situations that come up that you feel very out of control. And you kind of have to sit back and watch. And that's really difficult. So definitely a lot of prayer that this is the person you are supposed to marry, and that God is calling you to this calling. And if he is, he'll give you what you need, but you need to be clear on that. I would also say, like I just said, you need to have very frank and honest conversations with your intended on what are expectations. What does he expect as you as a pastor's wife? What do you expect as him as a pastor?
And
And a husband? What are kind of these visions you have laid out for marriage and ministry, because they're going to go together. They're not two separate parts of your life. And I would definitely, if possible, seek out those who are in ministry, not just mentors in your life, but specifically ministry mentors, elders, or the pastor in your church, or those sorts of things, who are well grounded in scripture, that can give you advice on some of the challenges, because each church is different. Each area you minister is different. And there are particular things that some people face in other areas that we don't face here, and vice versa. And so some of those unique challenges to where you might be called to minister, talk to people who are in that ministry and what they can sort of give you preemptively as advice or things to look out for.
right. So my advice to the man, and I'll say some to the women as well, but to the man, number one is, if you are discerning a call to ministry, understand that it is a sacrifice. Basically, you're going from the ministry God gave you in your home, and then you're widening the net to include the people in your community. So you need to make sure, and I say this with great love and respect for the calling that I received when I was 17. You need to discern whether this is of God or just wishful thinking, because some people have come into ministry over the last several decades, and it's always been there. The Bible warns about this, people who are hirelings, right? You need to discern that this is not just you thinking this is an easy paycheck. I go up there, talk for maybe 45 minutes. If you're in a modern church, 20 minutes per service, and then you're going to get paid all this money, and it's worry-free or hassle-free.
Right.
Ministry's not a get rich quick scheme. Okay.
Definitely not.
It's not that. Now, the other thing is, if God is not calling you to it, don't force it, because that will be the easiest way to get burnt out and to end up with so many pastors that have had moral failures, financial indiscretions with church money. So don't do that. Don't put yourself in a situation where, well, I wanna have control, or I wanna be seen as someone of influence. If that's the attitude, ministry is not for you. Or, to be gracious, it may be for you, but you don't have the right attitude. So you have to be mindful of that. Number two, you need to have your priorities right. And by that I mean, and this is something I learned. So I didn't come into ministry with this. I had the ideal, but I didn't put it into practice. Family is the first church. So my wife and my children, just as for you, they're gonna be your first church. And if a local church is not willing to understand that and appreciate that, you need to be asking questions. Why is that? What is it in the church culture that they don't see that as a priority? If you have a big number of people who maybe retired and they are without children, of course, they're not going to get it. If you have a family that has a lot of children in it, the parents will understand. But at the end of the day, it's the priority of your family is your first church. If this relationship is not working, my relationship with our kids is not going to work. And if those relationships are not working, it's going to bleed out into the church, and it's going to be a cause of reproach. So again, we need to learn to manage our household well. It starts with us discerning the call, discerning whether this is us or whether it's the Lord, the Holy Spirit. And I will also encourage you, if you're praying about entering ministry, it's okay to say no and stick by that. Your boundaries, the earlier you can set them up, the better. Not answering the phone after 7 p.m., talking to your staff. And hopefully, if you're in a healthy church, you have elders who can help you maneuver this, sharing the load with them. I'm going to toot the horn of a few men here in our church and their wives. Those men stand up and they lead well. And they do that not only in the preaching ministry, but they do so in areas of ministry. They do so in the way of taking care of the facility, when it comes to doing outreach, inreach, when it comes to just taking care of me, because I'm not perfect, and she neither is my wife, as much as I love her. Something that we remind our church members often is, if you want a healthy church, you're in the right place. Do you want a perfect church? This is not the church for you. We're not perfect, but we have a perfect Savior who's perfecting us and who loves us despite our imperfections. So find people who will help you say no for the right reasons. And I would say, lastly, don't be afraid of being real with the people you shepherd. One of the things that I have found very encouraging here in Vista Grande Church in the East Mountains of Albuquerque in central New Mexico, north central, is that people pay attention to the small details in our family. And one of the things people like, that I've been told by our members, is that they know that our family is not putting on a fake persona or identity. I mean, what they see with the boys is what they get.
Even if we tried, our kids would out us pretty
Yeah,
fast.
well, yeah. Not only that, the fact that you and I can have conversations, and sometimes, because we're human, they get to see us have tough little mibs here at the office sometimes, or they hear us when we're on the phone, and they know that we apologize, we love each other, we try to make the wrongs right, and we try to honor God in the messiness of life as it comes and goes. So don't be fake. Don't fake it till you make it. You never will make it. Just be who you are and be honest about, you know what, I'm a work in progress. The Holy Spirit's still working in me to become a better husband, a better father, a better wife, a better mother, and man, in your case, a better pastor. It's okay to embrace your imperfections and let God minister through them. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I'm sure we'll get to more fun stuff in a minute, so not at the moment.
Listen, this was the first episode for this particular series. I want you to see that we are just as human as everyone else, and you also get to meet my wonderful wife. We'll see you next time.